Think about the school you know, the buzz of the hallway, the weight of a backpack, the mix of excitement and dread on a Monday morning. Now, wipe all of that from your mind and travel with me 2,000 years into the past, to the bustling heart of ancient Rome. Because what if I told you that Roman schools were nothing like what we experience today? No sprawling campuses, no yellow buses, not even a single textbook as we know them. Instead, picture this: lessons held in open-air colonnades or crowded street corners, students hunched over wax tablets with styluses in hand, and an education system built not just on reading and writing, but on rhetoric, character, and sometimes brutal discipline. This was a world where education was a privilege, a tool, and for some, a form of social engineering on a scale that still echoes today. What was it really like to be a student in ancient Rome? You might be surprised to learn that the Roman approach to schooling was both strikingly familiar and profoundly alien. While they valued education deeply, it was also shaped by stark inequalities, where your family's wealth and status could determine not just what you learned, but whether you learned at all. And the curriculum, let's just say it involved memorizing vast texts, mastering the art of persuasive speech, and preparing for a life in public service, all under the watchful and often strict eyes of teachers who believed firmly in the power of correction, sometimes with a rod. There was no room for daydreaming or doodling in the margins here. This was training for citizenship, for power, for life itself. So if you've ever wondered how Roman children spent their days, what they studied, who was allowed to learn, and what it took to succeed or survive in a Roman classroom, you're in the right place. In this video, we're pulling back the curtain on one of history's most influential education systems. We'll explore the good, the challenging, and the downright shocking details of ancient Roman schooling. From the privileged sons of senators to the clever enslaved tutors who sometimes taught them, this story is full of twists, turns, and lessons that still resonate today. So settle in, class is about to begin. To understand the Roman classroom, we must first ask a fundamental question: who was even allowed to step inside, either literally or figuratively? The simple answer is that formal education was a luxury, a privilege reserved for a very select few. The vast majority of Rome's youth never experienced anything resembling a school. For a boy to receive a structured education, his family needed three key things: wealth, status, and citizenship. This meant the sons of senators, wealthy merchants, and well-established landowning families were the primary beneficiaries of the system we often picture. Their education was an investment, a carefully curated path designed to mold them into future leaders, politicians, and orators who would uphold the traditions and power of Rome itself. But what about the other half of the population, the girls? Their educational journey was almost entirely separate and overwhelmingly focused on preparation for a life within the home. While a daughter from an affluent family might be taught to read and write by her mother or an educated enslaved person within the household, the curriculum was starkly different. Her lessons centered on managing a household, weaving, and the social graces needed to be a respectable Roman matron. The profound idea of a girl attending a grammarian school to study rhetoric or philosophy was virtually unheard of. Her world was the domus, the private sphere, not the forum or the Senate floor. Then we come to the most significant and often overlooked group, the millions of enslaved people and the poor. For the children of Rome's enormous enslaved population, formal schooling was an impossible dream. Their value was measured in their labor, not their literacy. Any skills they acquired were purely vocational, learned through apprenticeship in a craft or through the brutal repetition of manual tasks. The children of the plebeian masses, free but impoverished, faced a similar reality. Their families needed every able body to contribute to the household income from a very young age. Sending a child to spend his days reciting poetry was an economic impossibility when he could be running errands, assisting a tradesman, or working in the fields. This stark division created a society where literacy and learning became powerful markers of class, cementing the social hierarchy for generations. The very structure of Roman education ensured that power and knowledge remained in the hands of those who already possessed them. So where did this carefully structured, deeply unequal system of learning actually take place? For the youngest Roman students, the setting was a world away from the dedicated school buildings we know today. Their classroom was called the ludus literarius, the elementary school, but this grand name often belied a remarkably humble reality. Forget quiet halls and bright, colorful classrooms. Instruction frequently happened in a rented room attached to a shop, a space under a stairwell, or even a semi-public corner of the bustling forum. There was no separation from the daily life of the city. Lessons would be conducted against a backdrop of street vendors hawking their goods, politicians giving speeches, and the general cacophony of urban Rome. The boundary between learning and life was almost non-existent, with education being a visible, audible part of the public sphere. Inside this space, the furnishings were as sparse as you can possibly imagine. The goal was purely functional, with no thought given to comfort or prolonged concentration. Students typically sat on simple, backless benches without any individual desks. Each boy, and it was almost always boys, would balance his writing materials on his knees. The primary tools of the trade were a wax tablet and a stylus. The tablet was a small wooden frame filled with beeswax, and the stylus was a pointed metal or bone instrument used for etching letters into the soft wax surface. The flat end of the stylus served as an eraser. You would just smooth the wax over to correct a mistake and start again. It was a practical, reusable system, but it required a steady hand and a patient demeanor, especially when your desk was your own lap. Overseeing this modest operation was the ludi magister, the schoolmaster. His role was absolutely fundamental, yet his social standing was often painfully low. Frequently, he was a freedman, and formerly enslaved person who had gained his freedom but still occupied one of the lower rungs on the Roman social ladder. The profession was notoriously poorly paid, relying on small, irregular fees from the parents of his students. This lack of prestige and financial security created a fascinating and tense dynamic within the classroom. Roman society demanded that children show immense respect for their elders and superiors, yet here was a teacher who, in the eyes of many parents and certainly their wealthy patrons, was himself a subordinate figure. This contradiction was often resolved through one thing: an unwavering emphasis on strict discipline. The magister's authority inside his ludus was absolute and was frequently maintained through the fear of corporal punishment. The rod or the whip was not just a threat, it was a standard teaching tool, a way to compel respect and ensure obedience from students who might have been conditioned to see their teacher as a social inferior outside the classroom. His power was confined to that one space, and he often wielded it with severity to compensate for his lack of status in the wider world. Now let's get our hands on the very objects a young Roman student would have known intimately, the tools that defined his daily academic life. Forget the neatly packed backpack of today. A Roman boys' school supplies were far more tactile and hands-on. His most crucial possession was the tabula, also known as pugillares. This wasn't a slate or a piece of paper, but a small rectangular wooden frame, perhaps the size of a modern hardcover book, with a shallow recessed area in the center. This recess was filled to the brim with a layer of discolored beeswax, often darkened with soot or pigment to provide a better contrast for the writing that would be etched into its surface. This wax tablet was the ultimate reusable notebook. It was personal, portable, and incredibly durable. To write on this waxy surface, the student used a stylus. This instrument was typically made from metals such as iron or bronze, though cheaper versions could be fashioned from bone or even sturdy wood. One end was sharpened to a fine point, perfect for carefully forming the letters of the Latin alphabet into the soft wax. The other end was flattened and smoothed into a small, rounded spatula shape. This was the ancient world's ingenious answer to an eraser. If a student made a mistake in his spelling, miscalculated a sum, or simply needed to clear space for a new lesson, he didn't need to reach for a separate tool. He would just flip the stylus in his hand and use the flat end to gently warm and smooth the wax back to a blank, even state, ready for another attempt. This cycle of writing and erasing was a constant physical rhythm in the classroom, a quiet scraping sound that would have been as familiar as the scratch of a pencil is to us. For more permanent work or for studying set texts, the student would graduate from his wax tablet to the papyrus scroll. These scrolls, containing works by great poets like Virgil or speeches by legendary orators like Cicero, were precious and expensive. To protect these delicate items on the journey to and from school, a student might carry them in a capsa. This was a cylindrical leather or wooden case, often with a domed lid, slung over the shoulder. It functioned like a protective tube, safeguarding the scrolls from the inevitable bumps and jostles of the crowded Roman streets and keeping them safe from the elements. So picture this young scholar, his wax tablet and stylus in hand for his daily exercises, and his capsa hanging at his side, holding the wisdom of the ages he was striving to master. So with his tools at the ready, our young Roman student would embark on the first and most grueling phase of his education, the absolute basics of literacy. This wasn't a gentle introduction with colorful picture books. It was a rigorous, repetitive, and almost militaristic drill designed to hammer the fundamentals into his mind through sheer force of repetition. The journey began with the alphabet itself, but this wasn't a silent, visual exercise of looking at letters on a page. The entire process was intensely auditory and communal. The ludi magister would call out each letter, and the students would chant it back in unison, over and over again, until the sequence was seared into their memory. They didn't just learn the alphabet forwards. A hallmark of Roman elementary education was the requirement to recite it perfectly backwards as well. This wasn't just a party trick. It was a profound exercise in mental discipline, proving complete and total mastery over the building blocks of language, ensuring the student could manipulate them from any direction. Once the alphabet was conquered, the next step was even more arduous: syllables. The student had to learn every possible combination of consonants and vowels. The magister would dictate and the class would drone in response: ba ba b b bi bi bo bo bu boo. Then they would move on to the next consonant, ca ka. This painstaking process continued through the entire alphabet. The goal was to achieve instant, unthinking recognition of these phonetic units. The noisy, chaotic environment of the rented room or open colonnade meant concentration was a hard-won skill. The drone of one group reciting syllables would mix with the shouts of street vendors outside and the murmur of other classes nearby, forcing each boy to focus intently on his teacher's voice to avoid a misstep and the stinging correction that might follow. Only after this exhaustive drilling in syllables would a student finally graduate to reading actual words and, eventually, full sentences. But even this was a far cry from how we learn today. There was no concept of sight words or easy primers. Their first reading material was often dauntingly complex texts like the Laws of the 12 Tables, the ancient foundation of Roman law, or the epic poetry of Homer, translated into Latin. The text was written in scriptio continua, a continuous string of capital letters with no spaces between words and no punctuation whatsoever. Decoding this was a slow, laborious process of sounding out each letter, combining them into the syllables they had memorized, and then finally parsing where one word ended and another began. It was less about comprehension and more about the flawless mechanical execution of decoding. This relentless rote method was the unglamorous, grinding foundation upon which all future eloquence and rhetoric were built. Every great Roman orator from Cicero to Caesar first had to endure this same noisy, repetitive chant, proving that the path to power in Rome began with the humblest of lessons. Successfully navigating the noisy, repetitive world of the ludus literarius was a major achievement, but it was merely the first gate a Roman boy had to pass through. Around the age of 12, for the fortunate few who continued their studies, the entire nature of education transformed. He would leave behind the elementary magister and step into the far more prestigious and intellectually demanding classroom of the grammaticus. This wasn't just a change of teacher, it was a profound upgrade in social standing, curriculum, and ultimate purpose. The grammaticus himself was a different class of educator entirely. Unlike the often low-status ludi magister, the grammaticus was a respected scholar, a man of letters who commanded a much higher fee from affluent families. His role was to shape not just a literate student, but a cultured young man, and his elevated social position meant he taught through intellectual authority rather than relying solely on the threat of the rod. The curriculum under this scholar underwent a dramatic shift, moving from mechanical skill to deep interpretation. The central pillar of this secondary education was the meticulous, almost reverent study of poetry. The works of great Greek authors like Homer were paramount, but the ultimate goal was mastery of the Latin classics, especially the national epic, Virgil's Aeneid. A student didn't just read these texts, he consumed them from every possible angle. Every line was subjected to intense scrutiny in a process known as prelectio, where the grammaticus would first read a passage aloud with proper pronunciation and rhythm before launching into a detailed lecture. This lecture or inoratio would dissect the text word by word. He would explain obscure vocabulary, unravel complex grammatical constructions, identify the meter and poetic devices, and illuminate the rich tapestry of mythological and historical allusions woven into the verse. But the study went far beyond mere literary criticism. For the Romans, these poems were not just stories, they were repositories of everything a well-bred citizen needed to know. The grammaticus used the text as a springboard to teach geography. By tracing the journeys of Aeneas or Odysseus across the known world, he taught history by explaining the legendary origins of Rome and the virtues of its heroes. He even taught science and astronomy, interpreting passages that described natural phenomena. This was the core of the Roman educational ideal, the concept of humanitas, the broad, holistic learning that developed a complete human being and a refined member of society. The student was no longer learning to read, he was reading to learn, absorbing the entire cultural and ethical framework of the Roman elite through the beautiful, complex language of its greatest poets. The student's own work evolved to match this higher level of analysis. His wax tablet was now filled with complex grammatical exercises, detailed paraphrases of poetic lines, and critical commentaries. He was trained to analyze a text for its moral lessons, evaluating the character's actions. Was Aeneas truly pious in abandoning Dido? This constant analysis cultivated a critical mind and a deep familiarity with the shared cultural language of the ruling class. Mastering Virgil was as much about learning to think like a Roman aristocrat as it was about appreciating beautiful poetry. It was an intensive grooming process designed to produce young men who could not only quote the classics effortlessly, but who understood the weight of tradition and the values they were expected to uphold. This deep immersion in poetry was only one side of the coin in the grammaticus's classroom. However, an equal amount of effort was dedicated to the art of prose composition, where students learned to craft language with precision and power. They moved from analyzing the masters to emulating them through a series of carefully graded exercises designed to build rhetorical muscle memory. One of the most fundamental was the crea, where a student would take a famous saying from a historical figure like Cato the Elder, such as Carthago delendesi, Carthage must be destroyed, and elaborate upon it. He would praise the author, paraphrase the sentiment, provide a reason for its wisdom, offer a contrasting viewpoint, and then draw a final conclusion, all within a tightly structured format. This wasn't about original thought, it was about learning to manipulate the building blocks of persuasive argument, to stretch a single idea into a well-ordered mini-essay. The exercises grew increasingly complex, training the young Roman mind to see every subject from multiple angles. A student might be asked to argue both for and against a mythological figure's fate, defending Helen of Troy one day and condemning her the next. He would practice composing concise summaries or synopses of lengthy historical narratives, forcing him to identify the most critical elements of a story and express them with clarity and economy. The ultimate goal of all this relentless practice was to achieve copia, a Latin term meaning abundance or plenty. This referred to a rich and ready supply of language, a vast mental warehouse of vocabulary, rhetorical devices, historical examples, and philosophical commonplaces that a speaker could draw upon instantly to elaborate on any topic, for any length of time, in a manner that was both fluent and impressively learned. This verbal dexterity was the hallmark of an educated Roman gentleman. Beyond the technical mastery of language, every text was mined for its moral and ethical content. The grammaticus was not just teaching literature, he was teaching a value system. The characters of the Aeneid were not merely protagonists in a story, they were exempla, models of behavior to be either emulated or rejected. Aeneas was the ultimate model of pietas, a complex sense of duty to the gods, to one's family, and to one's country. His abandonment of Dido, while heartbreaking, was framed as a necessary, even noble, sacrifice for the greater destiny of Rome. Conversely, a figure like Turnus could be analyzed for the destructive power of unchecked rage and pride. These stories provided a shared cultural vocabulary of virtue and vice, a common set of reference points that every member of the elite could understand and use to debate proper conduct. The poems were in effect the textbooks for Roman citizenship, teaching young men not only how to speak but how to be. They learned that eloquent speech was meaningless if it was not in service to the state, and that true leadership required both the wisdom to understand tradition and the rhetorical skill to uphold and defend it. This fusion of moral philosophy and linguistic skill was the true essence of a Roman liberal education, creating individuals who were prepared to lead, persuade, and perpetuate the very civilization that had so carefully molded them. For the small fraction of Roman boys who excelled under the grammaticus and whose families possessed the means and ambition, the educational journey reached its zenith around the age of 16. This was not a step up, it was a leap into an entirely different stratosphere of learning. They left behind the study of poetry and entered the world of the rhetor, a master teacher whose sole purpose was to forge masters of persuasive speech. This final stage of education, known as the School of Rhetoric, was the ancient world's ultimate finishing school for power. Think of it less as a general university and more as the most exclusive, intensive combination of law school, political strategy seminar, and executive leadership program imaginable. In a society without microphones, mass media, or political parties as we know them, the ability to command a room, sway a jury, and dominate a debate was the single greatest determinant of success. The rhetor's classroom was the final training ground where future senators, generals, and emperors were honed. The atmosphere in the rhetor's school was profoundly different from what had come before. The setting was likely more private and dignified, perhaps in a spacious room of the teacher's own home or a dedicated lecture hall, reflecting the elevated status of both the master and his pupils. The relationship between teacher and student transformed as well. These were no longer children, but young men on the cusp of their public careers. The dynamic became less about rote discipline and more about sophisticated mentorship. The rhetor was a respected professional, often a successful orator himself, and his role was to coach, critique, and polish his students into formidable speakers. While the threat of corporal punishment had faded, the pressure was arguably greater than ever, replaced by the intense weight of expectation and the fierce competition among Rome's best and brightest young minds. The curriculum here was ruthlessly practical and almost entirely centered on a single, demanding exercise, the declamatio or declamation. This was a simulated speech addressing a fictional or historical, legal, or political dilemma. There were two primary types of these practice orations. The first was the suasoria, a persuasive speech where a student would argue for a specific course of action, adopting the persona of a famous historical figure at a critical crossroads. He might counsel Agamemnon on whether to sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia to appease the gods, or advise Hannibal whether to march on Rome after his victory at Cannae. The goal was to build a compelling case using every tool of rhetoric, logical argument, emotional appeal, and a powerful ethical character. The second and more advanced form was the controversia, a mock legal debate based on a complex, often bizarre, set of fictional laws. A typical scenario might involve a law stating that a rape victim could choose between her attacker's execution or demanding his hand in marriage without a dowry. The student would then have to argue one side of the case, either for the prosecution or the defense, navigating the twisted ethical and legal ramifications to persuade his imaginary jury. These exercises were designed to be intellectually thorny, forcing the young orator to think on his feet, anticipate counterarguments, and employ every rhetorical device at his disposal to win over his audience. It was a grueling mental gymnasium where flexibility, creativity, and quick thinking were relentlessly exercised. To succeed in these declamations, students had to internalize the 5 canons of rhetoric, the essential steps to crafting a perfect speech. It began with inventio, the discovery of the most effective arguments for your case. This was followed by dispositio, the skillful arrangement of those arguments in the most persuasive order. Next came illocutio, the art of styling the speech with elegant language, powerful metaphors, and rhythmic cadence. Then memoria, the mastery of memorizing the entire oration for a flawless delivery. And finally, pronunciatio, the powerful and controlled use of voice, gesture, and body language to electrify the audience. The rhetor drilled his students in each of these disciplines, criticizing their posture, their hand movements, the modulation of their voice, and the structure of their sentences. He was building a human weapon of persuasion, where every word, every pause, and every glance was deliberate and potent. This was the ultimate expression of the Roman ideal that to control language was to control reality itself, shaping the opinions of the powerful and the masses to one's own will. Imagine being handed a scenario so ethically complex and dramatically charged that it would challenge even the most seasoned lawyer today. This was the daily reality for a student in the rhetoric school, where the core of his training was the declamatio. Far from a simple classroom exercise, this was a high-stakes simulation, a complete immersion into the world of legal and political argument that was the lifeblood of Roman public life. The goal was not just to speak well, but to think strategically, to persuade under pressure, and to perform with the gravitas of a seasoned statesman. These declamations were the final, crucial rehearsal before a young man stepped onto the actual stage of the forum, and the skills honed here would determine his future influence and power. The first type of exercise, the suasoria, was a masterclass in strategic counsel. A student would be required to adopt the persona of a legendary historical figure facing an impossible choice and then argue passionately for a specific path forward. Picture a young Cicero in training, not just reading about Alexander the Great, but becoming him, standing before his weary generals and mustering every rhetorical tool to persuade them to march further into India. The challenge was immense. He couldn't just state his opinion. He had to build a case that was logically sound, emotionally compelling, and ethically justified, all while staying true to the character's known traits and the historical context. He would employ sententiae, sharp, memorable maxims, to drive his points home. He would use exempla, drawing parallels from myth and history to lend authority to his advice. The suasoria was about more than persuasion. It was about inhabiting leadership itself, learning to weigh monumental decisions and project the unwavering confidence necessary to make others follow. If the suasoria was a seminar in leadership, the controversia was a brutal boot camp for the law courts. These exercises were based on a fictional set of laws, often designed to be paradoxical and intentionally outrageous, pushing a student's ingenuity to its absolute limit. A typical case might involve a law stating that a hero who saves a citizen's life in battle can claim any reward he wishes. Our young orator might then have to defend a war hero who, having saved a coward's life, now demands the coward's father, a famous general, bow to him in public. The student arguing for the hero would have to frame this demand not as an insult, but as a symbolic restoration of honor and a lesson in civic duty. His opponent arguing for the general would have to defend traditional hierarchy and the irreplaceable value of personal dignity. There were no easy answers, and victory went to the speaker who could construct the most airtight, creative, and emotionally powerful argument from a seemingly absurd premise. This taught flexibility, forcing students to see every issue from multiple sides and equipping them to handle any surprise or real courtroom or political debate might throw at them. The true magic of the declamatio, however, lay in its immersive, performative nature. This was not an essay to be handed in, it was a speech to be delivered. The classroom transformed into a theater. The student would stand, adopt the posture of a concerned citizen or a furious prosecutor, and project his voice to the back of the room. He was coached on every aspect of performance, the precise gesture of the hand to emphasize a point, the calculated pause for dramatic effect, the modulation of his tone from a whisper of conspiracy to a thunderous declaration of principle. This was the art of actio, or delivery, and the Romans considered it the most important part of rhetoric. A brilliant argument written on a page was useless if it couldn't captivate a live audience. The declamatio was the forge where raw intellectual material was hammered into a powerful, persuasive performance, creating men who didn't just know the right thing to say, but exactly how to say it to win. But alongside the prestigious grammaticus and the powerful rhetor, there was another ever-present figure in the life of a young Roman student, one who occupied a far more complex and paradoxical role. This was the paedagogus, a constant shadow from the moment a boy left his home until he returned each evening. To modern eyes, he might be mistaken for a simple nanny or a servant, but his function was far more profound and deeply revealing of the Roman social order. Typically an enslaved man or a freedman, the paedagogus was personally assigned to a single boy, acting as his guardian, his bodyguard, his moral compass, and his academic enforcer. He was the unseen teacher, the logistical backbone of a Roman education, and his existence underscores a stark irony. The system designed to create the most elite free citizens was utterly dependent on the labor of the unfree. Imagine the daily journey to school through the crowded, chaotic streets of Rome. A young boy from a wealthy family did not walk alone. By his side, or perhaps a step behind, was his paedagogus, a mature and trusted figure who shouldered the heavy caps full of scrolls and wax tablets. His primary duty was protection, both physical and moral. He was a bodyguard against the very real dangers of the city, but he was also a chaperone, tasked with steering his charge away from bad influences, distractions, and any behavior that might bring dishonor to the family name. He ensured the boy went directly to school, paid attention to his teacher, and returned home without dawdling. In a society obsessed with reputation and public appearance, the paedagogus was the family's first line of defense in preserving the dignity and proper conduct of its future heir. His role, however, extended far beyond mere supervision. Once home, the paedagogus became an academic drill sergeant. He was directly responsible for making sure the boy completed his assignments, drilling him on his grammar, and helping him memorize the lengthy passages from Homer or Virgil assigned by the grammaticus. Many of these men were highly educated, sometimes more so than the ludi magister himself. It was not uncommon for a wealthy Roman family to specifically seek out an enslaved paedagogus who was fluent in Greek, the language of high culture and advanced learning, to ensure his young charge would master it through constant conversation. This creates a deeply poignant and contradictory picture. An enslaved man who himself had been denied any formal rights or freedoms was now the personal tutor responsible for drilling the lessons of liberty, citizenship, and power into his young master. This relationship was a microcosm of the entire Roman world, built on a foundation of brutal inequality, yet fostering moments of unexpected intimacy and influence. The paedagogus spent more waking hours with the boy than his own father did. He was a constant authoritative presence, and the bonds that formed could be strong, often lasting into the student's adulthood. Some former students, upon gaining their own status and power, would ensure the freedom and comfort of the man who had guided them through their youth. Yet this personal connection never erased the fundamental power dynamic. The paedagogus remained property, his fate tied to the whims of the paterfamilias, the head of the household. His ability to discipline the boy existed only because it was delegated authority. He could correct and drill the future master, but he could never truly be his equal. This figure stands as one of history's most powerful reminders that knowledge and wisdom are not bound by status, and that the architecture of privilege has often been built by the very hands it holds in chains. The rhythm of a Roman schoolboy's life was dictated not by clocks or calendars, but by the sun and the sacred traditions of the city itself. His day began at the crack of dawn, long before the modern concept of a leisurely breakfast. He would rise, take a simple meal of bread and perhaps some fruit or cheese, and then, with his paedagogus by his side, step out into the still cool morning air. The journey to the ludus or the grammaticus's school was a part of the daily ritual, a trek through streets that were just beginning to stir with life. School commenced with the first full light of day, a practical necessity in a world reliant on natural illumination. There were no electric lights to push back the evening darkness, so every hour of sunlight was a precious commodity for reading and writing. The schedule was grueling by any modern standard. Lessons would continue uninterrupted for hours, a solid block of intense mental focus broken only by the inevitable need for a short respite. There was no ring of a bell to signal a change of class every 45 minutes. The curriculum flowed from one subject to the next under the continuous guidance of the teacher. The cacophony of multiple students reciting different lessons at once must have been overwhelming, demanding a level of concentration that would challenge even the most disciplined student today. The primary break in this marathon of learning came around midday for prandium, the Roman lunch. This was not a lengthy, relaxed affair. It was a practical pause, a chance to eat a simple, cold meal, often more bread, olives, and maybe some leftovers from the previous night's dinner, perhaps brought from home in a small cloth. Some students might have scurried home if they lived close enough, but for most, this was a brief interruption spent near the school. A quick refueling before the afternoon session demanded their attention once more. The academic grind would then press on until late afternoon, finally concluding only as the sunlight began to wane. This meant a school day could easily span 8 or 9 hours, a truly demanding commitment of time and mental energy. And what of the weekend? The modern Saturday and Sunday break simply did not exist. The 7-day week, with its divinely mandated day of rest, was a later development. For a Roman student, the relentless march of school days was punctuated not by weekends, but by a scattered collection of holidays that followed the complex rhythms of the Roman calendar. This calendar was a dizzying tapestry of religious festivals, public holidays, and market days, all intertwined. The most reliable breaks came on the Nundini, the 8-day market cycle that functioned as the ancient equivalent of a weekend. Every 8th day was a market day, and while not an official holiday from school, the sheer chaos and importance of the market often made it impractical to hold classes. It was a day for commerce, for public business, and for families to stock up on supplies. More frequent and varied were the countless feriae, or public holidays, dedicated to a vast pantheon of gods. A festival for Jupiter, a celebration for Minerva, a day of rites for Mars, each one could mean a reprieve from the wax tablets and scrolls. On these days, the city itself became the classroom, as students would witness the religious processions, sacrifices, and public games that were central to Roman civic life. While this might sound like a generous number of days off, it was an irregular and unpredictable system. A student might enjoy a cluster of holidays one month and then face a long, unbroken stretch of school days the next. There was no guaranteed 2-day break to look forward to, making the Roman school year a long and demanding marathon with irregular, albeit welcome, water stations along the way. If the demanding schedule and intense curriculum were the framework of Roman education, then the ever-present threat of corporal punishment was the brutal engine that was believed to drive it all forward. The modern concept of positive reinforcement or gentle guidance would have been utterly foreign in the Roman classroom. Here, the philosophy was simple and severe. Knowledge was not something to be gently uncovered, but a hard truth to be hammered into the student, quite literally. The primary tool for this was the ferula, a fearsome and familiar sight for any schoolboy. This wasn't a simple switch, it was a stout, heavy cane, often made from the wood of the fennel plant, from which it derived its name. Its purpose was singular and swift, to inflict a sharp, stinging pain on the palms of a student's outstretched hands for any perceived failure. A mispronounced word, a forgotten line of poetry, a messy wax tablet, or a moment of inattention, all were met with the same immediate and painful correction. The rhythmic, dreaded sound of the ferula striking flesh was as much a part of the classroom's audio landscape as the droning recitation of verbs. For more serious transgressions, outright disobedience, repeated mistakes interpreted as laziness, or any form of disrespect, the teacher would escalate to the scutica. This was a much more terrifying instrument, a stout, heavy leather strap, sometimes even a whip made from several thongs. While the ferula was for the hands, the scutica was often used across the student's back or legs, delivering a far more brutal and humiliating punishment. The distinction between the two tools was a grim grammar of pain, a graduated scale of suffering where the severity of the offense dictated the chosen instrument. It's a chilling image, a young boy, perhaps the son of a senator, being beaten by a low-status teacher, a man his family might otherwise scarcely acknowledge in the street. This inverted the normal social order entirely within the four walls of the ludus, creating a microcosm where the teacher's authority, however socially limited outside, was absolute and enforced through fear. This system of brutality was not seen as abuse, but as an essential and non-negotiable component of pedagogy. Roman society was militaristic and rigidly hierarchical, valuing discipline, obedience, and toughness above almost all else. The educational sphere was merely a reflection of this wider world. Think of it as a boot camp for the mind. The belief was that a comfortable student was a lazy student, and that the fear of pain was the most effective motivator for diligence and the retention of knowledge. The very Latin word for school, ludus, which also meant game or play, carries a dark, ironic weight in this context. There was nothing playful about it. This harsh approach was justified by a pervasive cultural belief that human nature, especially childish nature, was inherently prone to idleness and required rigorous correction to be shaped into something virtuous and useful. The pain of the ferula was framed as the necessary price for building a strong, disciplined, and honorable Roman character, a small sacrifice for the greater good of the student and the state he was destined to serve. While their brothers embarked on the formal path of the ludus and the grammaticus, The educational journey for a Roman girl was dramatically different, shaped entirely by the singular societal expectation that she would become a matrona, a respectable married woman, and the moral heart of the Roman household. For the vast majority, this meant that any notion of a schoolroom education was completely out of reach. Their classroom was the home itself, and their teachers were almost always female relatives or the family's enslaved women. The curriculum was not poetry or rhetoric, but a practical and moral training program designed to produce a capable manager and a virtuous wife. The ultimate goal was not to cultivate a voice for the public sphere, but to ensure she could effectively run the private domain, upholding the honor and smooth operation of her future husband's household. The core of this domestic education was intensely hands-on. From a young age, a girl would be stationed beside her mother or an enslaved craftswoman to master the art of weaving and the making of clothing. This was not a casual hobby, it was a fundamental duty and a powerful symbol of Roman female virtue. The rhythmic click of the loom was the soundtrack to a respectable woman's life. The wool once spun and woven into cloth was a tangible product of her industry, literally clothing her family and contributing to its economy. Alongside this, she learned the complex skills of household management. This meant understanding how to direct the labor of enslaved people, plan and budget for meals, oversee the preservation of food, and manage the intricate social dynamics within the domestic staff. She was being groomed to be the chief operating officer of a potentially large and bustling estate, a role that required sharp organizational skills and a firm yet fair authority. Yet the most crucial lessons were those of character. A girl was relentlessly schooled in the virtues of pudicitia, a profound sense of modesty, sexual fidelity, and moral purity and obsequium, the duty of loyalty and obedience, first to her father and then to her husband. Her value was measured by her reputation, and her behavior was constantly scrutinized to protect the family's good name. While some daughters from the most elite and intellectually progressive families might receive tutoring in literature, music, or even Greek to make them more engaging companions for their highly educated husbands, this was a rare exception. Even in these privileged cases, the purpose was never to enable her to participate in public debate, but to refine her for a life of supportive domesticity. Her education in its entirety was a preparation for a life lived in the background, her success measured by the order of her home, the legitimacy of her children, and the honor she brought to her family through her quiet, unwavering virtue. Now let's talk about the engine that powered this entire system. Cold, hard cash. In a world without public schools or state-funded education, knowledge came with a direct and often steep price tag. Roman schooling operated on a strictly private, fee-for-service model. The cost of instruction was known as the merces, a term that translates directly to wages or payment, and it was handed over directly from the parent to the teacher. This transaction happened on a specific day each week, the dies Mercedes payday. For the ludi magister, this was often the most anxiety-inducing day of his week, as his livelihood and his ability to rent that street-side teaching space depended entirely on the punctuality and generosity of his students' fathers. This direct payment system created a starkly different classroom dynamic than we're familiar with today. A teacher's income was unpredictable and often meager. The ludi magister in particular occupied one of the lowest rungs on the professional ladder. While a revered rhetor could command enormous sums from the elite families of his advanced pupils, the elementary teacher was notoriously poorly paid. His social standing was equally low. He was frequently a freedman, a formerly enslaved individual, and his profession was viewed as a trade, not a respected vocation. The Roman satirist Juvenal captured this contempt perfectly, scoffing at the list of lowly jobs one might be offered, including that of a grammarian, and he meant it as an insult. This combination of financial instability and social disrespect created a perfect storm of frustration that often boiled over in the classroom. The constant threat of the ferula wasn't just about discipline, it was also a reflection of the teacher's own powerlessness and stress. He ruled with an iron rod in part because it was the only sphere where his authority was absolute, a small compensation for his lack of respect in the world outside. The financial strain led to incredibly high turnover and a transient teaching environment. A magister might set up his ludus in a rented space one month, only to be forced to close up and move on the next if too many parents fell behind on their payments. This instability meant education was often interrupted and inconsistent. For the affluent rhetor, life was completely different. A famous orator like Quintilian, who founded a highly prestigious school of rhetoric in Rome, could enjoy immense wealth, political influence, and the patronage of the imperial family itself. But for every Quintilian, there were hundreds of unknown magistrates struggling to make ends meet, their lives a cycle of collecting small fees, dealing with demanding parents, and maintaining order in a rowdy classroom. This economic reality meant that for many Roman boys, their formative educational experiences were shaped by an overworked, underappreciated, and frequently harsh man who was just trying to survive in a system that offered him very little reward for the crucial task of building Rome's next generation of citizens. While the bustling classrooms of Rome itself offer a fascinating glimpse into this world, the true testament to the power of the Roman educational model lies in its astonishing reach. The empire's influence wasn't just carried by its legions and its roads, it was also spread through its wax tablets and its scrolls. From the misty frontier of Britannia to the sun-baked cities of Egypt, the Roman ideal of schooling was systematically exported as a primary tool of cultural integration, creating a fascinating patchwork of classrooms where Roman methods met local traditions. Imagine a young boy growing up in a newly established Roman town in southern Britain, perhaps Londinium or Camulogenum. His experience would be both familiar and strikingly different from his counterpart in the capital. The goal of his education was explicit and political: to Latinize him. His first language was likely a Celtic dialect, but from his earliest days in the ludus, he would be immersed in Latin. This was not optional. Latin was the language of law, commerce, and imperial administration. Fluency was the single greatest key to social advancement and a career in the local bureaucracy. His teacher, the ludi magister, might himself be a retired legionary from Italy or a Gaul who had already been through this process, now tasked with drilling the intricacies of Latin grammar into a new generation of provincial elites. The core curriculum was identical to that in Rome: the relentless chanting of the alphabet, the combinational syllables, and the study of the same foundational texts like Virgil's Aeneid. For this British student, however, these stories of Trojan heroes and Italian destiny were not his native myths. They were new, imported tales he had to master to claim his place in the ruling class of his own land. This process of cultural assimilation through education was even more pronounced in the highly civilized and ancient lands of the Eastern Empire, such as Greece, Egypt, and Syria. Here, Roman administrators encountered cultures with their own deep, proud, and far older intellectual traditions. In a city like Alexandria or Athens, a Roman school wouldn't simply replace the existing Greek educational system. It would exist alongside it, creating a unique two-track path for ambitious families. A well-off Greek youth might attend a traditional Greek gymnasium, studying the classics of Homer and Plato in the original Greek, while also enrolling with a Roman grammaticus to achieve flawless command of Latin law and rhetoric. This produced a fascinatingly hybrid intellectual, a person who could quote Plato in one breath and Cicero in the next. For the provincial elite, a Roman education became a brilliant career move, a way to curry favor with the governing authorities and secure positions of local power. They weren't abandoning their Hellenistic heritage, they were strategically layering a Roman identity on top of it to navigate the new political reality. Archaeological evidence brings this sprawling educational network to life in the most tangible ways. In regions as far-flung as Roman Gaul and North Africa, archaeologists have unearthed student exercises that are hauntingly familiar. There are wax tablets from Vindolando on Hadrian's Wall where a young scribe has painstakingly copied Latin vocabulary lists. There are potsherds called ostraca from Egypt covered in the clumsy, large-lettered writing of a child practicing his alphabet. And perhaps most tellingly, there are tablets containing lines from Virgil's Aeneid, written and rewritten by students hundreds of miles from Italy. These artifacts are more than just ancient homework, they are silent witnesses to a vast, standardized system of cultural programming. The empire was in effect running a massive franchise of its educational model, producing not just literate individuals, but loyal Roman citizens from Spain to Syria, all united by a common language and a shared cultural reference point drawn from the heart of the empire. Now let's pull a real book from that cap so our student has been carrying and understand the revolutionary and incredibly limiting technology that defined reading in the ancient world. Forget the bound volume sitting on your shelf. The standard format for a Roman book was the volume in a papyrus scroll. This was an object of both great beauty and immense practicality, a technological marvel that fundamentally shaped how knowledge was transmitted. Creating one was an arduous, expensive process. It began with the pith of the papyrus read, sliced into strips, layered at right angles and pressed together to form a smooth, flexible sheet. These sheets were then meticulously glued together side by side to form one incredibly long roll, often reaching 20 or even 30 feet in length for a major work like Virgil's Aeneid. The text was written in neat, continuous capital letters in narrow columns, creating a river of words without any spaces or punctuation to guide the reader. Two wooden rods called umbilici were attached to each end, functioning as handles to carefully wind and unwind the text as you read from left to right. This was not a book you could casually flip through. Reading was a deliberate, two-handed physical performance. Given the sheer amount of manual labor and imported materials involved, a single scroll was a luxury item, prohibitively expensive for the average Roman, let alone a student. It's here that we encounter one of the most defining constraints of ancient education. Most students did not own their own textbooks. They couldn't simply buy a copy of Homer to study at home. Instead, the classroom operated on a single precious master copy, almost always owned by the teacher himself. This physical reality dictated the entire rhythm and methodology of learning. The grammaticus would unroll his master scroll, the product of countless hours of a scribe's labor, and place it on a lectern. He would then read the day's passage aloud to the class, his voice providing the crucial punctuation and dramatic emphasis that the continuous script on the page lacked. The student's task was not to follow along in their own books, but to listen with intense concentration and transcribe the master's words directly onto their personal wax tablets. This transformed the act of reading into an active communal exercise in auditory capture. The classroom would have been filled with the soft scratching of dozens of styli as students worked to keep up, creating their own personal, temporary copies of the text. This process, known as dictatio or dictation, was the primary engine of knowledge transfer. It required immense focus. A moment of daydreaming meant missing a line of poetry, and there was no page to glance back at for reference. The student's wax tablet became his only access point to the authorized version of the text, a fragile and erasable draft of cultural inheritance. This reliance on a single master copy and student transcription placed an enormous premium on the power of memory. Since a student couldn't easily reread a text at his leisure, he had to internalize it during class. The relentless recitation and chanting we discussed earlier weren't just drills, they were essential survival skills in a world without cheap, accessible books. A student's success depended on his ability to quickly memorize large passages from the dictation, storing them in his mind for later recitation, analysis, and composition exercises. The entire educational system, from the chants of the ludus to the declamations of the rhetor, was built upon this foundation of prodigious memorization. The scroll wasn't just a container for words, it was a bottleneck that forced knowledge to flow through the channels of listening, writing, and most importantly, memorizing, creating a culture of learning that prized auditory skill and mental retention above all else. While the intense focus on language and rhetoric formed the core of a Roman education, a well-rounded young man was also expected to possess some competency in more practical and artistic fields. Beyond the scrolls of Virgil and the practice speeches, the curriculum made room for two other key disciplines, mathematics and music. However, the approach to these subjects was fundamentally different, reflecting their perceived place in the hierarchy of Roman values. Mathematics was not an abstract science to be explored for its own beauty, but a collection of practical tools essential for the world of commerce and administration. Music, on the other hand, was an art to be appreciated as a mark of refinement, not a skill to be mastered for public performance. The Roman approach to math was relentlessly utilitarian. For the vast majority of students, their mathematical education began and ended with arithmetic, learned not to unlock the secrets of the universe, but to balance a ledger. The subject was often taught by the grammaticus himself, and it centered on the needs of business, trade, and managing one's estate. The complex higher mathematics of the Greeks, like geometry and theoretical arithmetic, were largely left to specialist scholars and were not part of the standard educational track for a young gentleman destined for public life. His world was one of concrete numbers, calculating interest on a loan, measuring land for inheritance purposes, tallying the profits from a shipment of olive oil, or working out the payroll for his family's household staff. Mathematical fluency was a direct extension of financial and social power. The primary tool for this number crunching was the abacus, a device the Romans refined to a high degree of efficiency. This wasn't the familiar framed abacus with beads on wires that we often picture. The Roman version was typically a small, portable tray made of wood or metal with slightly raised ridges. Counters called calculi, from which we get our words calculate and calculus, were moved along these grooves. Each ridge represented a different decimal place, units, tens, hundreds, and so on, ascending up to the millions. A student would learn to rapidly add, subtract, multiply, and divide by sliding these counters back and forth according to a set of established rules. It was a physical, hands-on process, a world away from solving equations on parchment. The goal was speed and accuracy in commercial calculation, and mastering the abacus was as essential for a Roman businessman as mastering a spreadsheet is today. For more complex problems, particularly those involving fractions, Romans might use a dustboard, smoothing out a layer of sand or dust on a table and using a finger or a stylus to work out figures that could be easily erased, a temporary, large-scale version of their wax tablets. In stark contrast to the noisy, practical world of the counting board stood the study of music. For a Roman aristocrat, a knowledge of music was a non-negotiable component of humanitas, that ideal of well-rounded, cultivated learning. However, the Roman attitude toward musical performance was deeply ambivalent and colored by social prejudice. While the Greeks revered skilled musicians, Romans of the elite class looked upon professional performers, who were often enslaved or from the lower orders, with a degree of contempt. To perform music in public for money was beneath the dignity of a freeborn citizen. Therefore, the goal of musical education was not to learn to play the cithara, a type of lyre, with any great skill, but to achieve a level of cultured appreciation. A student would be taught the basics of musical theory, enough to understand the modes and rhythms that underpin the poetry he was already studying. He learned to recognize the ethical and emotional qualities that different types of music were believed to possess, a concept inherited from Greek philosophy. More importantly, he was trained to be a critical listener at the various musical performances that were embedded in Roman social and religious life, from private dinner parties to public festivals and theatrical productions. This educated appreciation allowed him to demonstrate his refinement and participate knowledgeably in conversations about artistic merit. It was the difference between being a concert violinist and a modern-day music critic. One performed the art while the other, from a position of social superiority, judged and appreciated it. This careful distinction ensured that a young Roman could be cultured without ever risking his status, his education in music serving as one final, polished marker that set him apart from the common masses. For all its deeply entrenched private and traditional nature, the Roman education system was not entirely immune to the influence of the most powerful men in the empire. While the vast machinery of learning continued to be funded by parental fees and run by independent teachers, a few forward-thinking emperors began to recognize that controlling the flow of knowledge and rhetoric could be as crucial to maintaining power as controlling the legions. This led to the first tentative steps of state involvement in an arena that had always been fiercely private, a shift that began not with a sweeping reform, but with a single pragmatic decision by Emperor Vespasian. Following the chaotic year of the four emperors and the civil war that brought him to power, Vespasian faced the monumental task of restoring stability and imperial prestige to Rome. Part of his strategy involved a clever and unprecedented investment in the intellectual infrastructure of the capital. Around the year 71 AD, Vespasian made a historic decision. He became the first emperor to appoint officially state-sanctioned and state-salaried professors of rhetoric. He selected the most renowned teacher of the day, Quintilian, and granted him a regular salary drawn from the imperial treasury. This was a revolutionary concept. For the first time, a teacher of advanced subjects was freed from the weekly anxiety of collecting his merces from students' parents. His financial security was guaranteed by the emperor himself, elevating the profession to a new level of prestige and, not incidentally, placing a key influencer of Rome's future leaders directly on the imperial payroll. This was far from the creation of a public school system as we would understand it. Vespasian's goal wasn't to educate the masses, it was a targeted political maneuver. By bringing a luminary like Quintilian into the fold, Vespasian accomplished several things at once. He signaled his support for traditional Roman values and elite culture, associating his reign with intellectual excellence and moral authority at a time when both were in short supply. More practically, he gained a degree of influence over the curriculum and the values being imparted to the sons of the senatorial and equestrian classes, the very men who would grow up to administer his empire or potentially challenge his successors. It was a soft power move, an attempt to shape the ideological landscape of the next generation by supporting its most prominent gardener. This model of imperial patronage proved attractive to subsequent emperors who saw the wisdom in Vespasian's approach. Emperors like Antoninus Pius and Marcus Aurelius, known for their philosophical inclinations, expanded upon this foundation. They extended state salaries beyond rhetoricians in Rome to include teachers of grammar and rhetoric in major cities throughout the provinces. These appointments were often tied to specific numbers, perhaps a set number of grammarians and rhetors for a city like Athens or Alexandria, and came with significant privileges, such as exemptions from costly public duties and local taxes that would otherwise burden a teacher. These exemptions were a powerful incentive, making the imperial appointment a highly sought-after honor that provided financial stability and social standing. Yet we must be careful not to overstate this development. This was not a ministry of education issuing a standardized curriculum. The system remained overwhelmingly private. The state-salaried professors were a small, prestigious minority, like endowed chairs in a modern university, existing alongside hundreds of unsalaried magistri and grammatici who still relied on student fees. The imperial intervention was sporadic, symbolic, and highly personalized, depending entirely on the interests and priorities of the individual emperor on the throne. It was a top-down bestowal of favor, not a bottom-up system of public provision. What began with Vespasian was the faintest flicker of an idea that the state had a stake in the content of higher education and that supporting it could be a powerful tool for ensuring political stability and cultural cohesion across the vast and diverse Roman world. But all of this discussion of curriculum and discipline can feel abstract, a reconstruction from ancient texts. To truly understand the visceral reality of a Roman education, we must travel to one specific place and moment in time, a day that ended in catastrophe but preserved a classroom for eternity. The city of Pompeii, buried under volcanic ash and pumice in the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, offers us an unparalleled, heartbreakingly intimate window into the daily lives of its inhabitants, including its youngest students. Here, the theoretical framework we've been exploring is given a name, a face, and a voice, frozen at the very moment of a lesson. Among the most poignant finds from the ash-hardened ruins are the personal wax tablets of Roman students. These are not replicas or later copies. They are the original tools, carbonized and preserved by the superheated pyroclastic flow. We can hold in our hands the very tabula that a young Pompeian boy balanced on his knees, its wooden frame still faintly smelling of smoke after 2 millennia. The wax filling is long gone, but the wood often retains the faint, ghostly impressions of the stylus marks, the ethereal echoes of his homework. On some, we can even make out the exercises, a carefully etched alphabet, a list of syllables, or the first clumsy attempts at writing his own name. These objects are so ordinary, so personal that they collapse the centuries. The frustration of a difficult word, the pride of a perfectly formed letter, the boredom of repetitive drills, all of these very human emotions are embedded in these small, silent wooden frames. Perhaps even more powerful than the portable tablets are the lessons literally etched into the city's walls. As you walk through the excavated streets of Pompeii, you don't have to look far to find the scratchings of its youth. Public walls, the interior courtyards of homes, even the columns of the forum served as informal practice slates for young fingers armed with a sharp stylus or piece of charcoal. This graffiti is a chaotic, vibrant mix of the sacred and the profane, but nestled among the boasts and drawings are clear examples of schoolwork. Archaeologists have identified numerous inscriptions of the alphabet, written out in order, just as the ludi magister would have demanded. There are practice sentences, lists of verbs conjugated over and over again, and even lines from Virgil's Aeneid, the foundational text of the grammaticus's classroom. One famous example scrawled on a wall is a direct quote from the epic, "Canticula omnes intentique ora tenebant." All became silent and held their faces intent. It's a line describing the tense moment before a character begins a story, a moment of rapt attention. The irony is profound. Here, a student was practicing a line about total silence, likely in a noisy, bustling environment, his own act of writing it now forever silencing his city. This graffiti wasn't vandalism in the modern sense. It was a natural byproduct of an educational culture that relied on constant repetition and practice, wherever that practice could physically occur. The city itself was their notebook. These marks, both on portable tablets and permanent walls, transform our understanding from the academic to the achingly human. We are not just learning about Roman education, we are witnessing it in progress. We see the universal struggle of a child grappling with the complexities of language, the tangible evidence of the drills and chants that defined their school days. The volcanic ash that so horrifically ended these lives is also the very reason we can hear their scholarly whispers across the ages. Pompeii doesn't just give us a description of a Roman classroom, it gives us the classroom itself, a haunting and powerful testament to the universal, enduring pursuit of knowledge, even when time itself seems determined to erase it. For most young Roman men, the intense rhythm of school days came to an abrupt halt in their mid-teens. This wasn't a graduation ceremony with a diploma, it was a simple, practical conclusion. The family's financial resources were exhausted, or the boy's labor was now more valuable to the household than further study. He would exchange his wax tablet and stylus for the tools of a trade, stepping into his father's workshop, joining a mercantile venture, or taking up a role on the family farm. His formal education was over, its primary goal achieved, functional literacy for business and the basic cultural knowledge expected of a respectable citizen. But for the elite, the sons of senators, wealthy equestrians, and ambitious provincial families, this was not an end. It was a crucial transition, the moment their theoretical training was tested in the real world. Their education now entered its most prestigious and influential phase, a grand tour of advanced learning known as the Peregrinatio Academica. This was the ultimate capstone experience, a necessary journey to complete the formation of a future leader. The destination was almost always Greece, the very cradle of the rhetoric and philosophy they had spent years studying in Latin translation. A young man would travel to Athens to walk in the footsteps of Plato and Aristotle, or to Rhodes to study at the famed schools of oratory. He would immerse himself in the vibrant intellectual atmosphere, attending lectures by renowned philosophers, honing his Greek to absolute fluency, and engaging in debates with the best minds from across the empire. This was more than just academic tourism. It was a powerful status symbol that separated the truly cultured from the merely educated, providing the final polish on a world-class intellect. Upon returning to Rome, brimming with the prestige of his Greek studies, the young aristocrat's grooming was still not complete. He now embarked on the tirocinium fori, a period of apprenticeship that was the ancient equivalent of an elite internship. Literally translated as the beginner's camp for the forum, this was where theory met practice in the high-stakes arena of Roman politics and law. A promising young man or tyro would attach himself to a senior statesman, a distinguished senator, a powerful general, or a celebrated advocate in the law courts. He wouldn't just watch, he was expected to be an active participant in the daily life of his mentor. He would accompany him to the Senate House, observing the cut and thrust of political debate. He would stand beside him in the basilica during trials, learning the intricate dance of legal procedure and courtroom persuasion firsthand. This apprenticeship was a masterclass in networking, power brokering, and the unspoken rules of conduct that governed the Roman elite. The tyro learned by doing, perhaps researching legal precedents for his mentor's case, drafting early versions of speeches, or even delivering smaller, less important arguments himself under the watchful eye of his patron. His performance here could make or break his entire career. A sharp, loyal, and rhetorically gifted tyro would earn powerful friends and invaluable recommendations. A clumsy or lazy one could find himself sidelined before his public life had even properly begun. The tirocinium forged the crucial personal connections and practical experience that no schoolroom declamation could ever provide, transforming a polished student into a viable political operator. For some, particularly those from families with a strong military tradition, this political apprenticeship might be preceded or followed by a period of military service, a tirocinium militiae. Serving as a junior officer or tribunus militum in a legion stationed on a distant frontier was another proven path to building a reputation. It demonstrated courage, leadership, and loyalty to the state, qualities that were highly valued in the political sphere. Whether through the law courts, the Senate, or the army, the ultimate goal was the same: to accumulate enough influence, reputation, and practical skill to launch one's own candidacy for public office and begin the ascent up the political ladder, the cursus honorum. The end of schooling was, for Rome's future leaders, merely the exchange of one classroom for another, far more complex and demanding one. Yet even after mastering the law courts and the political arena, after the grand tour of Greece and the military tribunate, the most ambitious and intellectually curious members of the Roman elite sought one final, transformative experience. This pursuit existed entirely outside the established path to power and prestige. It was a choice, not a requirement. For these men, the ultimate form of higher education was not found in the bustling forum or the prestigious school of a rhetor, but in the quiet, often austere study of philosophy. This was the final refinement of the soul, a journey inward that represented the absolute peak of Roman intellectual and personal aspiration. Studying with a philosopher was a fundamentally different endeavor from training with a rhetor. Rhetoric was about external mastery, the power to shape the world through persuasive speech. Philosophy was about internal governance, the power to shape oneself through disciplined thought and ethical understanding. It was less a curriculum and more a way of life, a personal commitment to the pursuit of wisdom for its own sake. Wealthy Romans, particularly during the early empire, would seek out renowned philosophical teachers, often attaching themselves to a specific school of thought. The most popular by far was Stoicism, a philosophy that resonated deeply with the traditional Roman values of duty, self-control, and resilience in the face of adversity. But other schools, like Epicureanism with its focus on attaining tranquility and avoiding pain, also had their devoted followers, including influential figures like the poet Lucretius. The study itself was intensely personal and conversational. A student wouldn't just listen to lectures, he would engage in deep, probing dialogues with his teacher, a method inherited from Socrates and Plato. They would tackle the biggest questions imaginable. What is a good life? How does one face death without fear? What is our duty to our community? How can we control our emotions and judgments to achieve inner peace? This practice of dialectic, rigorous question and answer aimed at uncovering truth was the core of the pedagogical method. It trained the mind to think critically, to challenge assumptions, and to build a robust, logical framework for living. The goal was to develop an unshakable character, a man who could remain virtuous and steady whether he was enjoying great fortune or enduring terrible misfortune, exile, or even the threat of death. This pursuit was the ultimate expression of odium, a Latin concept meaning worthwhile leisure. For a Roman aristocrat, constant political activity and business negodium were the default state. To withdraw from that fray, even temporarily, to dedicate time to philosophical study was a profound statement of priorities. It signaled that one's personal cultivation and virtue were as important as public service. Figures like the younger Seneca, who was both a powerful advisor to Emperor Nero and a prolific Stoic writer, embodied this dual life. His philosophical works were not abstract academic exercises. They were practical guides for navigating the anxieties, temptations, and corruptions of absolute power. He argued that true freedom came from within, from mastering one's own desires and perceptions, a message that held immense power for men operating in a capricious and often dangerous political world. In the end, philosophical study was the capstone of the Roman ideal of humanitas. It represented the belief that education was not merely a means to a career, but a lifelong process of becoming a more complete, ethical, and resilient human being. While the rhetoric school produced powerful men who could rule the world, the philosopher's garden aimed to produce wise men who could rule themselves. It was the most personal and profound level of education, where the pursuit of knowledge finally culminated in the ancient and most challenging command, know thyself. Looking at the Roman system from our modern perspective is like gazing into a distorted mirror. We can recognize the origins of our own educational ideals, but the reflection is alien in its starkness and severity. The most profound legacy the Romans left us is the very concept of a liberal arts education. Their unwavering focus on language, literature, and persuasive speech as the foundation for citizenship and leadership is the direct ancestor of humanities degrees and law school prerequisites today. When a modern student analyzes a Shakespearean sonnet for its metaphors or deconstructs a political speech for its rhetorical devices, they are participating in a tradition that was systematized 2,000 years ago in the colonnades of Rome. The Roman belief that studying poetry, history, and philosophy creates a well-rounded, ethical, and articulate individual remains the core justification for these fields of study, even as their practical value is constantly debated in our increasingly technical world. Yet for all these familiar echoes, the chasm of difference in access is almost incomprehensible. We take for granted a world where public education is a universal right, a concept that would have baffled a Roman. Their system wasn't just unequal, it was intentionally exclusionary, a finely tuned machine designed to replicate the existing social hierarchy. Today, we strive, however imperfectly, for inclusion and equity, with laws mandating education for all children, including those with disabilities. In Rome, the very idea of educating the vast majority of the population, the poor, the enslaved, and most girls, was not even a consideration. Their world operated on a principle of educated privilege, where knowledge was power to be hoarded, not a light to be shared. This fundamental difference in purpose is perhaps the greatest divide between their classroom and ours. The physical and psychological environment of learning would feel utterly foreign to any modern student. Imagine a child used to a brightly lit, temperature-controlled classroom with individual desks, interactive whiteboards, and walls covered in encouraging posters being transported to a Roman ludus. They would find themselves on a backless bench in a noisy, open-air space, balancing a wax tablet on their knees with the constant threat of a beating for any minor error. The modern emphasis on creating a safe, supportive, and stimulating learning environment is the complete antithesis of the Roman model, which valued discipline, obedience, and resilience forged through fear and discomfort. Our understanding of child psychology and positive reinforcement has completely reshaped the teacher-student dynamic, moving from a relationship based on authority and punishment to one ideally built on mentorship and encouragement. Even the ultimate goals of education reveal a profound shift in values. The Roman system was ruthlessly pragmatic and singular in its aim to produce effective citizens who could argue, lead, and perpetuate the state. Our modern systems, while still concerned with creating productive citizens, also embrace a much wider set of objectives. We value fostering creativity, critical thinking, collaboration, and personal well-being. We educate for personal fulfillment and to nurture a wide range of talents, from the artistic to the athletic to the technical. A Roman would see a music class, a chemistry lab, or a physical education period as a bizarre and wasteful diversion from the serious business of studying rhetoric and grammar. Our curriculum is a sprawling buffet of knowledge. Theirs was a targeted, high-calorie meal designed to build a specific kind of political muscle. In the end, studying the Roman system doesn't just teach us about the past, it holds a mirror up to our own choices, forcing us to question what we value, who we include, and what we ultimately believe education is for. Now, given everything we've explored about the rigid structure and severe discipline of the Roman classroom, you might be picturing a scene straight out of a Hollywood epic, rows of boys in pristine white togas, solemnly reciting verses in a grand marble hall. It's a compelling image, but it's almost certainly a complete fiction. Let's clear away the cinematic smoke and mirrors to reveal the surprisingly ordinary reality. First, the toga. This cumbersome woolen garment was the formal business suit of the Roman male citizen, reserved for public appearances in the forum, official ceremonies, and, crucially, wasn't worn by boys until they came of age around 14 or 15. A young student rushing to his lessons in a crowded, muddy street would have found a toga impossibly impractical. Instead, he would have worn a simple, knee-length tunic, much like any other Roman child, perhaps with a cloak for cooler weather. The idea of children practicing their letters while draped in 9 feet of formal white wool is one of history's most persistent and amusing misconceptions. Another popular myth is that Roman education was an unrelenting horror show of brutal beatings and nothing else. While it's true that corporal punishment was a standard and accepted tool, The reality had more layers than a simple tale of cruelty. The relationship between a student and a respected grammaticus or rhetor could evolve into one of genuine mentorship, especially in the advanced stages. A teacher like Quintilian, who was paid a salary by the emperor himself, famously argued against excessive flogging, writing that it was degrading and that encouragement was a far more effective motivator. He encouraged teachers to understand their students' individual characters and to make learning engaging. So while the threat of the ferula was always present in the elementary ludus, the experience at higher levels could involve thoughtful feedback, intellectual camaraderie, and a shared passion for dissecting the nuances of a poetic line. It wasn't all fear. There was also room for pride in mastering a complex text and the satisfaction of winning a respectful debate against a peer. Perhaps the most surprising truth is that Roman students did get breaks, and their school year was punctuated by a surprising number of holidays, just not the predictable weekends we know. Their calendar was filled with religious festivals, market days, and public games, any of which could mean a day off from lessons, and even within the long school day, there was likely a spirit of camaraderie among the boys. They would have shared the experience of struggling with a difficult translation, helped each other with memorization, and exchanged whispers and jokes when the magister's back was turned. The graffiti found in Pompeii, some of which is clearly schoolboy practice, also includes doodles, boasts, and inside jokes, proving that the Roman child's impulse to goof off and connect with friends was just as strong then as it is now, even within a system designed to suppress it. The reality was a mix of severity and normalcy, where the universal experiences of childhood persistently poked through the cracks of a fiercely disciplined world. So as the final lesson fades and we close the wax tablet on this exploration, what are we to make of the Roman school? It was a world of profound contradictions, a system that could produce both breathtaking eloquence and brutal subjugation. At its heart, we see the immense privilege of education, a luxury granted only to a select few boys whose path to power was paved by the labor of the unfree and the exclusion of nearly everyone else. We see a relentless, often harsh discipline where the ferula was as common as the stylus, built on the belief that knowledge was not gently uncovered but hammered into place. And we see the overwhelming centrality of language itself, the idea that to master words was to master the world, to shape reality through the power of persuasive speech in the law courts and the political arena. This entire elaborate structure, from the noisy ludus to the philosophical garden, was in service of a single powerful ideal, paideia. This Greek concept, which the Romans wholeheartedly adopted, meant far more than just schooling. It was the complete cultivation of a human being, the pursuit of culture, virtue, and wisdom that defined a civilized man. The Roman pursuit of paideia didn't just shape individuals, it shaped an empire and ultimately the entire Western world. It built the administrative framework that held a vast territory together for centuries, transmitted the literature and philosophy of antiquity through the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, and established the model of rhetorical and legal training that still underpins our own systems of law and leadership. The echoes of the ludus are all around us in every university lecture hall that teaches the humanities, in every courtroom where lawyers argue a case, and in our enduring belief that a well-rounded education is the foundation of a functional society. It's a legacy both inspiring and cautionary, a reminder of how far we've come and the values we've chosen to prioritize. We'd like to know which part of this ancient academic journey resonated most with you. Was it the shocking reality of the classroom discipline, the sophisticated training of the rhetors, or the poignant role of the enslaved paedagogus? Share the fact that surprised you the most down in the comments. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the past, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell for more mysteries from the ancient world. The past is full of stories waiting to be unrolled.